All right, We Who Wrestle with God, part 2. If you missed the first part of this, in the first part of the video, I wanted to kind of walk through my claim of I think this is probably the most important religious book that has been written in my lifetime. And I walked through a couple of the things of if you have a bad reaction to that and you're not interested in this book, maybe listen to some of this to give you some insight into why I would say that and into why I think you should read this book. So you can check that part right here if you haven't seen that. Otherwise, we're going to move right on. So in this part of the video, I normally do not dig super down into trying to do really big reviews of books, right? I am a big proponent of what I want to do here is if I find a book that I think you should read, I don't want to tell you what it says because then you'll feel like you've read it and like you don't need to read it because you heard what it said because I told you what it said, right? And that's not what I want. If anything, I want to inspire you to read the book for yourself because I don't know what you need out of it and I don't know what you would get out of it. But in general, if I just summarize it for you, you will feel like you got what you needed to out of it, even if maybe you didn't, right? So normally I am not the big long reviews person, right? But for this one, I just want to talk about it. I just have all my favorite quotes from every single chapter, and I just want to talk about them. So that's what we're gonna do on this one. And this sounds bad, but honestly, I don't think a lot of you are going to read this book. A lot of people are going to look at it and be like, "Oh, it's too big." You know, even if you're like, "Yeah, I should do it," you're like, "Oh, it's too big." And so I'm kind of hoping that if you are just not going to ever put forth the effort to read it, at least if you listen to this video, I can expose you to some of the ideas that he talks about and shares, and you can get some of the benefit of it from that. So, all right. So the beginning of the book is the chapter called Foreshadowing, and it's the still small voice. And the passage that I had from here was, he says, "The Bible is the library of stories on which the most productive, freest, and most stable societies the world has ever known are predicated. The foundation of the West, plain and simple." And this is one of those things that kind of goes back to why I was talking about why this book is so important, because this is one of those self-evident facts that for some reason is just like not self-evident anymore to a lot of people, right? So to look back in all of history and be like, hey, what's one of the greatest countries that has ever existed? And to answer the United States, obviously, right? For so long was such a just implicitly understood thing and obvious answer that it's like, I don't even have to make arguments for why that's the case. Like anybody can just look at history and be like, oh yeah, obviously one of the standout countries in all of human history has been the United States. And then even looking at world history as a whole and looking at the story of Western civilization can look at it and be like, obviously comparing the good done by Western civilization, right, throughout all the different stages of history is just immensely more than any other civilizations. Like the advancements to human flourishing and the reduction of human suffering that has come from that is just way more than anything else that you could compare it to, right? And this is one of those things that I think is so foundational because there's such a confused view looking back in history and trying to be like, no, see, like that country, you know, specifically, we'll just talk about the US because that's where I live, right? But to look at it and be like, no, it's been a net negative on humanity, right? And it's just like, what? I'm sorry. Like that doesn't make any sense at all. Like you cannot logically make that make sense. And in the same way, to look at the country and say, you know, it was not founded on biblical principles, again, is like, you can't make that logically make sense. You can't actually go and engage with all of the founding material in a open-minded and honest way and come away being like, yeah, no, it doesn't have anything to do with Judeo-Christian values, right? So I love the beginning of this because what Jordan does so well is state the implicitly obvious things that have been implicitly obvious for so long that for some reason are just no longer implicitly obvious to a bunch of people. And so he doesn't try to pretend like that's not the case, right? He recognizes for some reason this is not implicitly obvious to people anymore. And so I need to state it explicitly because otherwise people just won't get it, right? So I loved that from just the very beginning of it. It's just like, obviously, the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen have come from the progress of Western civilization, and the progress of the kingdom of heaven as far as it concerns Judeo-Christian values and everything is so intertwined with the history of Western civilization that you cannot ever discount it as the primary factor driving so much of all of the good things that came from Western civilization, right? So that's the first thing. Chapter 1 is called In the Beginning, and the quote that I had from this one is where he says, "The biblical account ascribes to each of us a value that places us at the very pinnacle of creation, a value that is very good and a cosmos that is good, a value that supersedes all earthly evaluation given our reflection of the image of the divine itself. This, it must be understood, is a matter of definition, the stake in the ground around which everything else must rotate, established upon humanity's divine reflection. This is nothing less than the description of the moral order implicit in the cosmos itself, reflective of the nature of God, man, and woman, and the foundation on which the idea of intrinsic rights and sovereign responsibility is based." And I know that's a long quote, but again, it's one of these things that is like, if this, a thing that used to be implicitly understood, right? If there is no fundamental difference between man and the animals, then everything else just falls apart. Like there's no reason to do any of the things that we feel like we have a moral obligation to do if fundamentally man is no different from animal, right? And so I love the realization that he has of like the thing that explains the best how and why man is different from animal is the biblical idea that man carries the reflection of the divine, right? That's the most obvious distinguishing factor between man and the other animals, right? And again, this is just one of those things that should be so self-evident, but apparently is not anymore, where this view is that man is just an animal. And the way that I love that he talks about this and where he digs into this in this chapter is that you cannot maintain any kind of society if your core assumption is that man is just another animal. Because if man is just another animal, then all of the things that man has to do to maintain and grow and engage with society they're all pointless, and you shouldn't do them, and you should just act like an animal, in which case no progress of humankind would ever have been made, right? So it's this idea that the most fundamental thing that we have to understand, again, goes back to that very first worldview question of creation, which is that there is something fundamentally different about man than about anything else on the earth, right? So yeah, I think that's all I have for that one. Next up in chapter 2, the chapter was Adam, Eve, pride, self-consciousness, and the fall. And the passage that I had from this chapter was where he says, "Do not touch what must necessarily remain sacred. Otherwise, the center cannot hold and things fall apart. Something has to be the unmovable object, the sacred staff, the unshakable pillar, and even perhaps the tree for the serpent. Something has to be that around which everything else arranges itself. That is God himself, ineffable though he may be. The closer to God the presumption, the more care must be taken in its approach, let alone its rejection or revolutionary overthrow. The attempt to make the moral enterprise a matter of human judgment, rather than to leave in place a necessary minimum of assumptions, is to make the prideful move that transforms the rock upon which the house would otherwise stand into the sand that shifts, moves, and devours when the storm comes." And this was the point that I really was thinking a lot about when I was reading Ryan Holiday's third book in his Stoic Virtues series, because it was a book about the virtue of justice. And in the beginning of it, what he said was, this is not a book about how we know what is right and wrong. This is just a book about doing what's right and wrong. We all know what is right and wrong. This is just a book about doing it. I don't want to talk about how or why we know what is right and wrong. And the argument that I had with this was that the way that a lot of people try to view this is that, well, right and wrong is just based on our subjective opinions, right? But also there's just certain right and wrong things that we just all know and we all agree upon, right? And the problem with that is that if you take a subjective opinion plus another subjective opinion and you add them together, you don't all of a sudden get an objective opinion, right? You just have a bigger subjective opinion. So the question of it is like, okay, well, there are things that all of us agree are wrong, right? Murder. All of us agree that murder is wrong, right? Except that one, not all of us do agree with that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any murderers among us, which we do, right? So that's not a universal agreement thing. And even if it was, the fact that you add subjective opinion plus subjective opinion plus subjective opinion plus subjective opinion does not all of a sudden fundamentally change the thing to be an objective reality, right? So when we are talking about the deepest kinds and the most fundamental kinds of truths, these truths have to be objective truths that are sourced somewhere other than our subjective experience, right? And I love the way that he talks about this in here with the idea of the centers. Like there has to be some central thing that everything else rotates around. It's by necessity, it must be the case. And this is super apparent when you understand the law of non-contradiction, right? Because people will say all the time, well, all truth is subjective, right? And you're like, okay, so is that subjective? It's like, no, like that is the truth. Like the truth is that all truth is subjective. And you're like, okay, but if the truth is that all truth is subjective, then that truth is subjective, which means that some truth isn't subjective. Like, so in order for that to be true, it has to be false, right? That is the law of non-contradiction. And that's what he digs into so much in here, is that when we try to pretend like the law of non-contradiction doesn't exist, you just, like, your whole world falls apart. Something has to be central. Something has to be fundamentally, objectively true, because everything else has to be true or false in reference to that unmovable and immovable thing, right? So, yeah, I think that's all we got on that one. The next chapter was Cain, Abel, and sacrifice. And the quote that I had in here was where he says, Cain's descendants are also the builders, the engineers, the makers of cities, musical instruments, tools, and implements of war. This is not to say that building or engineering is something wrong in itself, only that the fundamental problem of ethical conduct is not amenable to a technological solution. There are no better tools in the hands of misguided strivers. Better tools, when the aim is wrong, merely means more rapid movement down the wrong road or toward the wrong up. And I loved this quote because it coincides with something that I say a ton, which is that what you're doing is always built on a foundation of why and how you're doing it, right? So a lot of times the what doesn't matter nearly as much as the why and the how. So we have these, especially when it comes to technological stuff, because I'm Mr. Tech person, I love all this stuff, but it's like, if the why and the how that you are using this thing is misaligned, then this tool only allows you to go faster or more efficiently in the wrong direction. It's not that the tool itself is misguided or bad or evil or whatever. It's just that if you are going to use it in a way that is evil or misguided or bad, the tool is going to make your use of it infinitely more effective, right? And I just love that idea of like, there are no technological solutions to moral failures, right? And again, this is one of those very just seemingly self-evident things that is just not evident to people anymore. But again, it goes back to this idea of people don't really think that we live in any kind of a moral universe. So if you don't think that morality even exists at all, then obviously the only solutions or the best solutions are just technical solutions to get you to the thing more faster, more efficiently, more easier, whatever you want, right? And I love the connection that he makes between the spirit of Cain being a refusal to present the correct sacrifice, right? and to do the thing that is necessary to aim up properly, and the spirit that tries to bypass the hard work necessary to get a reward, right? So the spirit of Cain being a spirit that is against right sacrifice, leading to the spirit of what I would call like the spirit of AI, that's like, hey, I can just have AI summarize this book for me, and it's the same thing as me having done the work to read it. Or if I just have AI, if I'm able to prompt AI to write a song for me, that means that I know music and I know how to songwrite. And it's like, no, it means you know how to prompt AI. Like, you don't know anything. Like, you think that you know music, but you can't play any instrument. You can just prompt in in a chatbot. Like, that's not the same thing, right? So how this spirit of Cain carries on into the spirit that tries to utilize technology for shortcuts to the ends that we want to get to, because we're not willing to sacrifice what it takes to actually get there properly. And then next up, we had the chapter Noah, which was God as the call to prepare. And he says, what is the idea being put forth here? That truth is such a potent force that even the tyranny of the overwhelming majority cannot prevail against it. And how could it prevail unless reality itself did not exist, and everything was reducible to human presumption and whim? A whole polity set against the spirit of being and becoming itself is still wrong, and wrong in a manner that the consensus multiplies and deepens rather than alleviates. There is no more wrong than when everyone agrees to be wrong. That is the very definition of a totalitarian state, which are not so much top-down tyrannies as collective agreements to abide by nothing but the lie. And this just it hit me so hard, because I was just finished taking the Hillsdale online course about Marxism, socialism, and communism. And this idea of these tyrannies were primarily allowed to continue simply because the everyday and average person agreed to live by the lie being passed down, right? And so it was like one of the quotes that they talked about was, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. The reason why these tyrannies are able to continue on is not so much because of top-down force, but more because of the bottom-up response to some of that force being like, okay, well, it's fine. I'll just pretend to work, and then you can pretend to pay me, and we can all be good. We'll all be fine over here, right? And it's this collective agreement to just lie about the most obvious things that are not true, right? And that's a really big point for me. So I loved that quote. That one really stuck out to me a lot. The next one that I had was from the chapter, The Tower of Babel, God versus Tyranny and Pride. And the quote was, the sinners upbraided by Christ are those who have willingly broken the mysterious third commandment. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Exodus 27. As discussed earlier, this commandment forbids the claiming of divine virtue or service to God when the pursuit in question is purely that of self-interest, forbids the subversion of what is highest to what is manipulatively cunning and instrumental. And I loved this because this is something that I have personally struggled with for a long time, because I'm always someone who has cursed a little bit. And never cursed like a sailor or anything, but I've always just been someone that was just habitually I curse some. And there's been this issue with me with people talking about, but it's that's going against their commandments. It's like taking the Lord's name in vain. And then also more specifically on a New Testament side, people saying, well, don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth. And I'm sitting here going, okay, but doesn't unwholesome talk come in a whole bunch of other ways other than just words that we consider to be bad words? Wouldn't gossiping be considered unwholesome talk? And wouldn't, sharing secrets of somebody that you told you wouldn't that be unwholesome talk? And isn't, talking to somebody else about someone instead of talking to them, isn't that unwholesome talk? And isn't, saying loving things when your heart actually isn't loving towards that person and lying to them, isn't that isn't there a whole bunch of other ways that unwholesome talk is a thing, and not just oh, I said a dirty word, damn, And I had just never heard this take on the third commandment of like, yes, like it's not really about thou shalt not say GD, right? But it goes much deeper than that to mean that don't claim to be serving God when you're not serving God. Don't claim that the Lord said this when the Lord didn't say this, right? Don't claim that God is leading you to this thing when really it's just your selfishness leading you to that thing, right? And so I loved that take on it, which he actually mentioned earlier in the book, but it was just such an interesting way of viewing that commandment to me of like, yeah, don't say that you're doing something for God that you're not. Don't say that you're doing something in God's name that you're not. Don't say that God is leading you to do something when really you're just leading yourself to do it, right? And I just love that. I love that way of thinking about taking God's name in vain, claiming to be serving something bigger than what you actually are in this particular moment. And the next chapter was Abraham, God as spirited call to adventure. And the quote in here was, Abram's life is therefore portrayed as a sequence of sacrifices, each more exacting than the last, in keeping with the existential fact that each vista of increased opportunity and responsibility requires a sojourner whose aim is ever more precise, culminating in a transformation so complete that it requires a new name for its proper signification. This is how the life of every individual could unfold if it unfolded completely. As our domains of mastery grow, we must increasingly let go of who we were so that we can become who we could more completely be. Even though it is God who calls Abram forward, the results are, in a sense, catastrophic, at least by the standards of the original personality. And I freaking loved this because I was like, oh my gosh, that is the definition of my life. Like following God, the results of it has been catastrophic by the definitions of who I was when I first started out following God on this journey, right? Like that guy does not exist anymore. Like he has been completely obliterated in the process of following God through all of these different phases of my life, right? And I just loved that phrase. Like even though he was following God, the results in a sense are catastrophic, at least by the standards of the original personality. And again, this is one of those reasons why Jordan was talking to John Rich that one time and was like, this is why I'm so hesitant to just straight up be like, yes, like Jesus is God incarnate. I'm giving my life over to him. I completely surrender everything to him. It's like, because he has this understanding of this, of like, this is what this truly means. Like the results of this will be catastrophic as far as the original personality of what you originally were is concerned, you know? And he had just told John in that one interview that he's like, you know, I'm terrified of that. I'm terrified of what God will demand of me if I give my life to him, because I know if I give my life to him, I will do whatever it is that he demands of me, right? And I'm terrified of what it is that he will actually ask, right? So yeah, just I love that phrase. I was like, that wording is just so good. Catastrophic, at least by the standards of the original personality. That's just chef's kiss to me. And then next up, we had the first chapter on Moses, which was God as dreadful spirit of freedom. And the quote in here, he says, "It is precisely those who have honestly pursued what calls to them who get to the bottom of things. It is such people who are apt to become genuine leaders, to become those to whom others will voluntarily turn, particularly in times of crisis. This is because they have discovered in their truthful pursuit what is necessary to know, but that others refuse to or simply do not yet know. It is the ability to give word to the vagaries of now and to lay out a compelling direction into the future that constitutes leadership, and the genuine article, not the counterfeit that uses fear and compulsion. Those who have looked deeply into things become those who speak with the strange and marked authority attributed so frequently to Christ himself." And I love this because it made me think of something that I had heard Pastor Alex talking about one time. And she was talking about the difference between having influence and having authority, right? And how influence is something that you can just gain just by, getting yourself out there and, putting stuff out and knowing how to play the social media game and all this stuff and whatever. And you can have influence to get your voice into other people's ears. But if you have not walked out the things that you were talking about, if you have not had God actively change you and grow you and develop your soul in these things, you will not walk in a level of authority, right? Influence means you have the ability to speak. Authority means you have the power to actually change something, to be the agent of change that God uses in someone's life. And that difference between influence and authority just being something that stuck with me so much of like, I want to walk in authority in these things, not just influence in these things. I don't want to have the appearance of having learned this or having gained this or whatever. I want to actually walk in the effects in my life that come from this being real in my life. And and I think when you do that, you can't end up other than becoming that leader and stepping into that leadership role for some number of people, because that's what people are longing for, is those examples of people who have actually walked this out, who's not theory on these things. It's not just, mindless acceptance and repetition of things that they've heard other people say. It's actually lived out, blood, sweat, and tears having changed you and formed your soul as you've walked through learning these lessons for yourself. And it results in this weightiness and authority to when you speak, that is just like, that's what I want to walk in every area of my life, right? And then following that was the second chapter on Moses, which was Hedonism and Infantile Temptation. And in here, the quote was, let's see here. Another unbearable truth. There is no pit of hell so deep that something more bottomless could not yet be revealed, brought about by some faithless, treacherous, and craven act or omission. This is true for individual and society alike. The abyss is truly bottomless. There is no situation so terrible that some stupid son of a bitch cannot make yet worse. And that means you and me. And this is one of those things that I was talking about in this first video, is like, this is a foundational thing on Jordan's journey towards Jesus, is this realization that like hell is real. Like not in a lake of fire, whatever, sense, but in a sense of suffering that never ends and is always capable of being made worse, right? He has this realization while studying the horrors of the 20th century that just, oh my gosh, like the minute you think that this is as bad as it can get, there is something that someone can do to make it even worse, right? And this idea of hell being a bottomless pit of suffering is one of the things that had to be reestablished in him before he was ever open to hearing the gospel message, right? And this is just something that I think is going to be so necessary for so many people moving forward in these days, is they have to have a reestablishment of the reality of hell and of endless, bottomless suffering that is a result of us, not of some external thing, right? And just there is no situation that cannot be made worse by the actions of some person, right? And that realization was such a turning point in his story, and I think is the thing that's going to be a turning point in a bunch of other people's stories as we move on in these times that we live in. And then following up on that, in the next chapter was Jonah and the eternal abyss. And he says, if it is true that evil exists, and if the reality of this truth becomes self-evident, once evil has been encountered and seen for what it is, then the opposite of evil is something equally real, even in the mere form of the contrary direction, even in the ineffable form of the alternative to the journey to hell. If there is a pathway to the abyss, our direction on that road can be reversed. Why should we assume that there is any difference between getting as far away from Satan as possible and climbing Jacob's ladder? Or are we somehow willing to admit that only hell truly exists? Oh man, jeez, just like, I cannot tell you how important I think that is for moving forward and ministering to the current generations of lost people in our time, because so many of them have been deluded into believing that hell doesn't really exist, right? That at at our core and at the most central point of everything is this good wonderfulness thing and not this endless pit of suffering and destruction, right? And so before they are ever able to hear the vision and the answer to the redemption question that the gospel offers, they have to be brought back into an understanding and acceptance of reality that, like, at a bare minimum, you cannot argue that hell does not exist. Like, that is just absolutely delusional, right? And he has a quote for that at one point somewhere in there. You know, he's like, if you truly believe that hell does not exist, you are the most naive person who has ever lived. You have been like the most blessed and protected in your whole entire life. You have never studied history. You are incredibly misguided. Like, you cannot take an honest look at the world and not understand that hell exists. But as soon as you have that realization that hell exists, then by definition, something that is the opposite direction of hell has to exist, right? And that is what leads you on this journey that Jordan has gone on. And yeah, so then the final thing was in the conclusion, the quote that I had was, he said, everyone who takes the easy road ends up lying to themselves about who they are, what they are doing, and why they are doing it, attempting as they do so to distract and mislead God himself. And that just like one of my favorite quotes, the thing I say to my family, my friends all the time is, it's stolen from that book from the brothers Karamazov. But it's basically, above all, do not lie, especially to yourself. And the extension of it is because if you lie to yourself, you're lying to the Spirit of God inside of you. And if you'll lie to God, you'll lie to anybody, right? And I just, oh, man, I love it. 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 Because above all, do not lie, especially to yourself. And if you don't lie, if you commit to telling the truth, you cannot but eventually travel the same path that Jordan has been traveling all of these years of his life, that will, if you continue on it and God gives you grace enough to continue on it for long enough, will always end up at the feet of Jesus, and then you will be forced to decide what you are going to do with him, because you cannot spend your whole life telling the truth and end up anywhere other than at the feet of the truth. So, yeah, I love this book. It's amazing. Obviously, I think you should get it. I just spent, 40 minutes talking about it, or however long this has been. You should absolutely get it. There's a link in the description for it. There's a link in the description for some of my other favorite books. And yeah, if you made it this far, leave a comment that says, I have wrestled with God. And yeah, I think that's all I got for now. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.